In the pre-dawn darkness of Eastern Europe, 6 Russian fighter jets sat on a military airstrip, their engines warming, pilots running final checks. Fuel tanks full, weapons armed. Mission briefed. In 90 seconds they would be airborne, ready to strike Ukrainian positions deep behind enemy lines. But 60 kilometers away, Ukrainian air defense operators sat in silence, watching their screens, waiting, breathing, fingers hovering over firing controls. They had one chance, one window, one moment when those jets would be at their most vulnerable, climbing through the sky, laden with fuel and ordnance, unable to maneuver. This is the story of how patience became Ukraine's deadliest weapon, and how modern air defense transformed from reactive protection into offensive art form. To understand what happened on that airfield, we need to understand the evolution of the hunter and the hunted. The relationship between aircraft and the weapons designed to destroy them is as old as military aviation itself. During World War II, air defense was crude but voluminous. Anti-aircraft artillery, flak, fired thousands of explosive shells into the sky, creating walls of shrapnel that bombers had to fly through. It was inefficient. For every aircraft shot down, thousands of shells were expended. The sky became a lottery of metal and luck. But even then, military theorists understood a fundamental truth. The most vulnerable moment for any aircraft is takeoff and landing. Low altitude, predictable flight path, maximum weight, minimum maneuverability. The missile age changed everything. In the 1960s, surface-to-air missiles, SAMs, proved they could reach up and pluck aircraft from the sky with terrifying precision. Soviet SA-2 missiles downed American U-2 spy planes flying at 70,000 feet. North Vietnamese SAM operators shot down hundreds of U.S. aircraft during the Vietnam War. But early missiles had limitations. They were massive, immobile systems that took hours to set up. Radar signatures were obvious, and they were purely defensive, reacting to threats after they were already airborne. By the 1980s, air defense had evolved into something more sophisticated. Mobile launchers could reposition rapidly. Radar systems became more advanced, capable of tracking multiple targets simultaneously. Fire control computers calculated intercept solutions in milliseconds rather than minutes. The Soviet Union developed the S-300 system, a mobile, long-range air defense platform that NATO considered one of the most dangerous weapons in the world. It could engage aircraft at ranges exceeding 150 kilometers, track dozens of targets, and fire multiple missiles in rapid succession. Desert Storm in 1991 showcased the next evolution. Suppression of enemy air defenses became an art form. Coalition forces used electronic warfare, anti-radiation missiles, and stealth technology to blind, confuse, and destroy Iraqi air defense networks before the main attacks began. The lesson was clear. In modern warfare, whoever controls the air controls the battlefield, and controlling the air meant controlling the systems designed to deny it. But there was another lesson from Desert Storm, one that military planners in Moscow studied carefully. The coalition didn't just suppress Iraqi air defenses, they hunted them where they lived. Tomahawk cruise missiles struck hardened aircraft shelters. Precision-guided bombs cratered runways. Entire air bases were rendered unusable within hours. The Americans had demonstrated that air superiority doesn't begin when aircraft are in the sky. It begins on the ground, where they're most vulnerable. Parked, refueling, rearming, crew changes, maintenance, the entire logistical chain that keeps military aviation operational. This doctrine shaped American military thinking for 3 decades. But it required something the United States possessed in abundance. Standoff weapons with ranges measured in hundreds of miles. Stealth bombers that could penetrate defended airspace undetected. Satellite networks providing targeting data with meter-level precision. Ukraine, in February 2022, possessed none of these advantages. Their longest-range strike systems were Soviet-era Tochka-U ballistic missiles, inaccurate, limited in number, and with a maximum range of just 120 kilometers. Their air force couldn't penetrate Russian airspace without catastrophic losses. Their drones were small, commercial models adapted for reconnaissance, not strategic strikes. So Ukrainian forces watched, helpless, as Russian aircraft operated from airfields often less than 50 kilometers from the border. Close enough that civilians in Kharkiv could sometimes hear the jets taking off. Close enough that Ukrainian air defense radars tracked them continuously, but far enough that Ukraine couldn't touch them. The frustration was tactical and psychological. Russian pilots would launch from these sanctuary bases, cross into Ukrainian airspace, fire missiles or drop bombs, then return to safety. The air bases had hardened shelters, layered air defenses, and the implicit protection of Russian strategic doctrine. Strike our territory, face nuclear escalation. This asymmetry defined the air war's first year. Ukrainian forces became masters of defensive operations, ambushing Russian aircraft near the border, timing their missile launches perfectly, but they couldn't address the source of the threat. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, military analysts worldwide expected Russian air power to achieve air superiority within days. Russia possessed one of the world's largest air forces, over 4,000 military aircraft, advanced Su-35 fighters, Su-34 strike aircraft, K-52 attack helicopters. The doctrine was proven: establish air dominance, then use that dominance to devastate ground forces. Ukraine's air force, by contrast, was outnumbered nearly 10-1. They had aging Soviet-era MiG-29s and Su-27s, many barely operational. Their air defense network consisted largely of Soviet systems, S-300s, Buks Tors, that Russian forces knew intimately, having designed them. Every military projection gave Russia complete air superiority within 72 hours. But something unexpected happened. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and Ukrainian skies remained contested. Russian aircraft began flying lower, avoiding Ukrainian SAM envelopes. Close air support missions decreased dramatically. Strategic bombing campaigns were limited. How? How did a smaller, older air defense network hold off a vastly superior air force? The answer lay not in technology alone, but in tactics, training, and something more intangible: the psychology of patience. Ukrainian air defense operators developed a doctrine that NATO would later study intensively: the disciplined hold. Instead of immediately engaging every detected aircraft, revealing their positions and depleting precious missiles, they waited. They tracked. They calculated. They understood that Russian pilots, confident in their numerical superiority, would eventually make mistakes, fly predictable patterns, become complacent. And in modern air combat, complacency is lethal. Western intelligence agencies began providing real-time targeting data through secure networks. NATO AWACS aircraft flying in Polish and Romanian airspace could see deep into Ukrainian territory, providing early warning of Russian aircraft taking off from their bases. This created a new paradigm. Ukrainian air defense crews often knew about threats before those threats became airborne, and that knowledge created opportunity. But knowledge without reach is just intelligence, not power. Ukrainian commanders could see Russian aircraft on satellite imagery, lined up on tarmacs at Engels Air Base, at Morozovsk, at Saki in occupied Crimea. They could watch maintenance crews service them. They could track sortie rates and operational patterns. They could see everything. They could strike nothing. That calculus was about to change. In the summer of 2023, Ukrainian defense industries, operating from scattered facilities and underground workshops, had been working on a solution. Drawing on commercial drone technology, guided missile components, and improvised engineering that would have been impossible without Western intelligence sharing and technical assistance. They developed something new, not a weapon system in the traditional sense, not a missile designed by committee and tested for years, but a platform, adaptable, producible in quantity despite wartime constraints, and with enough range to turn sanctuary air bases into contested territory. The first long-range Ukrainian drones began striking deep into Russia in late 2023. Oil refineries, military installations, and eventually, airfields. Russian air defenses designed to stop high-altitude bombers and cruise missiles struggled against small, slow-moving drones flying at treetop level. Some got through, many didn't, but the ones that did proved a concept. Russian air bases were no longer sanctuaries. By early 2025, Ukrainian strike capabilities had matured. Drones flew in coordinated swarms. Flight paths became more sophisticated, exploiting gaps in radar coverage. Payloads increased from symbolic harassment to operationally significant destruction, and Russian commanders faced a new reality. Their aircraft were vulnerable not just in Ukrainian skies, but in their own. March 2024. The war has ground into its third year. Russian forces have adapted their tactics, launching airstrikes from bases deep inside Russian territory, beyond the range of most Ukrainian air defense systems. Su-34 fighter bombers would take off from Engels Air Base, nearly 800 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, conduct their missions, and return before Ukrainian missiles could threaten them. But one airbase was different. A forward operating base in occupied Luhansk had become Russia's primary launch point for tactical airstrikes in the Donbass region. 6 Su-34 fullbacks were stationed there, two-seat strike aircraft capable of carrying precision-guided munitions, designed for the exact mission Russia needed. Surgical strikes against Ukrainian armor and artillery positions. The base was well defended. Panzer's one-point defense systems surrounded the perimeter. Electronic warfare equipment jammed GPS signals. Russian air defenses created overlapping coverage zones. On paper, it was nearly impregnable, but Ukrainian intelligence had been watching, monitoring, learning. They noticed patterns. Every 72 hours, the Su-34 Squadron launched pre-dawn strikes, 4 to 6 aircraft, taking off in rapid sequence, forming up at low altitude, then climbing to medium altitude for their ingress into Ukrainian-controlled territory. The pattern wasn't just predictable, it was operationally necessary. Russian doctrine emphasized concentrated strikes, overwhelming a single target area, with multiple aircraft in a compressed time frame maximized effectiveness, while minimizing exposure to Ukrainian air defenses. This meant tight launch windows, sequential takeoffs with minimal spacing, formation assembly over friendly territory. Russian commanders believed their layered defense made this safe. The Panzer systems could engage incoming threats. Electronic warfare would blind Ukrainian targeting systems. Their own fighters could scramble in minutes if Ukrainian aircraft approached. The doctrine had worked in Syria, in Georgia, in Chechnya, but doctrine assumes your enemy fights the way you expect them to. The timing was predictable. Dawn twilight provided enough light for visual confirmation, but complicated visual tracking. The aircraft would be heavy, full fuel loads for the mission, maximum ordnance for target destruction. And there was another factor Ukrainian planners recognized: pilot psychology. The morning launch routine had become exactly that, routine. After dozens of successful sorties, after weeks of unopposed operations from this airbase, Russian pilots had developed confidence that bordered on complacency. Their pre-flight briefs mentioned Ukrainian air defenses as a threat in the operational area, not near the departure airfield. Their threat assessment calculated risk beginning at the line of contact, not during takeoff. This psychological blind spot was as valuable as any intelligence on defensive systems. Ukrainian air defense commanders saw an opportunity, but it required something extraordinarily difficult: positioning mobile SAM systems within range without being detected, then maintaining that position until the exact moment of vulnerability. The operation took 2 weeks to prepare. A single S-300 battery, 4 launchers, 8 missiles was selected. The crew was hand-picked, veterans with over a decade of experience, operators who had survived dozens of engagements. The battery commander was a 42-year-old lieutenant colonel who had operated S-300 systems since 2008. His crew called him Professor because of his methodical approach to every engagement. He taught them that air defense wasn't about technology, it was about patience, positioning, and understanding your enemy better than they understood themselves. For this operation, he personally supervised every detail: route planning that avoided known Russian surveillance, timing movements to coincide with Russian shift changes when alertness was lowest, selecting a position that offered both effective engagement geometry and rapid displacement routes. They moved at night, in total electronic silence. No active radar, no radio communications, navigation by GPS and pre-plotted coordinates. They positioned themselves 58 kilometers from the Russian airbase, just inside maximum engagement range, far enough to remain undetected. The position was carefully chosen, a depression between 2 low ridges, providing natural terrain masking from ground-based observation. Agricultural buildings nearby offered visual camouflage. Most importantly, the position was in a direct line between the Russian airbase and the Ukrainian lines. Russian pilots wouldn't be scanning their rear sectors for threats during takeoff. Then they waited. For 6 days, the Ukrainian crew remained in position, camouflaged, silent, enduring. They couldn't risk active radar emissions that might alert Russian electronic warfare systems. They relied on external targeting data, NATO surveillance aircraft feeding information through encrypted channels, Ukrainian intelligence assets monitoring Russian communications. The waiting was harder than combat. Soldiers rotated in 2-hour shifts, maintaining constant readiness while preserving alertness. They ate cold rations, no fires, no unnecessary movement. The battery's radar systems remained powered but passive, absorbing emissions rather than broadcasting them. Meanwhile, Ukrainian intelligence worked overtime. Human sources near the airbase reported maintenance schedules. Signals intelligence intercepted Russian communications, confirming the 72-hour strike cycle. NATO surveillance provided high-resolution satellite imagery showing showing the exact parking positions of the 6 Su-34s all. This information flowed to the battery commander through encrypted burst transmissions, short, irregular data packets that mimicked civilian cell phone traffic, nearly impossible to distinguish from background electromagnetic noise. Every 72 hours, they watched on passive sensors as Russian jets took off. 6 aircraft, same routine, same pattern, but they held fire, waited, because firing too soon would alert the Russians, would compromise the position, would waste the opportunity. The first launch window passed. The crew watched the aircraft take off, listened to the roar of engines that they couldn't see, tracked thermal signatures on passive infrared sensors. Some soldiers wondered if the operation had been canceled. Others questioned whether waiting through multiple cycles was necessary. The professor was adamant, we get one chance, one perfect shot. If we take it before every condition is optimal, we waste years of war learning for 60 seconds of impatience. The second launch window passed, then the third. The psychological pressure was immense. Soldiers maintaining absolute silence while enemy aircraft flew overhead. Knowing that Russian counter-battery radar could detect a missile launch within seconds. Knowing that Russian strike aircraft could be redirected to their position within minutes. But there was something else. The knowledge that if they succeeded, they wouldn't just destroy aircraft. They would demonstrate vulnerability. They would inject uncertainty into every Russian launch from forward air bases. They would make Russian commanders question whether any position was truly safe. Psychological warfare operates at multiple levels simultaneously. On the 7th day, March 17th, the conditions were perfect. Intelligence confirmed the squadron would launch at 5:47 a.m. local time. Weather was clear, no nearby Russian air patrols. Ukrainian electronic warfare units were positioned to jam Russian communications the moment the engagement began. At 5:42 a.m., NATO surveillance confirmed aircraft movement at the target airbase. Jet engines spooling up. 6 aircraft preparing for launch. The Ukrainian battery commander made the decision. Active radar, now. Lock targets the moment they're airborne. Fire when they're climbing through 8,000 feet. Still in formation, unable to maneuver effectively. At 5:47 a.m., the first Su-34 rotated off the runway. 12 seconds later, the second. The squadron was launching in rapid sequence, exactly as intelligence predicted. The Ukrainian S-300 battery's radar illuminated. 48 megawatts of radio frequency energy painted the Russian aircraft with invisible precision. Fire control computers calculated intercept trajectories, accounting for target speed, altitude, aspect angle, atmospheric conditions. The Russian pilots received immediate warning. Radar warning receivers in their cockpits screamed, "Missile lock, threat bearing 270, range 55 kilometers." But they were at their most vulnerable point, heavy climbing in formation. The tactical manual said to break formation, deploy chaff and flares, dive for terrain masking. But they were over their own airbase, at low altitude, with 5 other aircraft in close proximity. At 5:48 a.m., 8 S-300 missiles launched in ripple-fire sequence. 2 missiles per target for the first 4 aircraft. The missiles accelerated to Mach 6, climbing on intercept trajectories, their active radar seekers acquiring the targets. The flight time was 32 seconds. The first Su-34 attempted a hard brake right, dumping flares. The second missile adjusted its trajectory, home on jam mode activated, tracking the aircraft's own electronic countermeasures. At 5:48 and 32 seconds, the missile detonated its proximity-fused warhead, 18 meters from the Su-34's right engine. Fragmentation shredded hydraulic lines, punctured fuel tanks, destroyed flight control surfaces. The aircraft pitched nose down, entered an uncontrolled spin, and impacted the ground 4 kilometers from the runway. Both crew members ejected but were too low for successful parachute deployment. The second Su-34 took a direct hit. The missile's 70-kilogram warhead detonated on contact, breaking the aircraft's spine. It disintegrated in midair. The third aircraft's pilot reacted faster. Split-second decision, maximum performance dive, full afterburner. The first missile overshot, but the second adjusted, compensating for the target's evasive maneuver. Detonation occurred 30 meters above the aircraft. Shrapnel damaged both engines. The pilot managed a controlled crash landing on the airbase runway, the aircraft breaking apart on impact. Both crew members survived with injuries. The fourth Su-34 evaded successfully. Chaff deployment, aggressive maneuvering, terrain masking. It escaped the engagement envelope and returned to base. The engagement lasted 90 seconds. 3 Su-34 aircraft destroyed or damaged beyond repair. 4 aircrew killed, 2 wounded. Russian combat air operations from that airbase ceased immediately. The Ukrainian S-300 battery displaced within 4 minutes of missile launch, moving to a pre-planned alternate position before Russian forces could respond. It was a textbook example of modern air defense doctrine: intelligence preparation, tactical patience, perfect timing, and immediate displacement. But more than that, it was a demonstration of how smaller forces, using asymmetric tactics and disciplined execution, could achieve disproportionate effects against larger, more heavily equipped adversaries. Within hours, Russian military leadership ordered changes across their forward operating bases. Launch times became randomized. Aircraft dispersal patterns changed. Combat air patrols began flying protective coverage over air bases during launch windows. Electronic warfare systems were repositioned, but the damage was already done. Not just the physical loss of aircraft, but the operational cost of uncertainty. Every security measure added time, complexity, and resource allocation. Randomized launch schedules reduced sortie efficiency. Additional defensive coverage meant fewer aircraft available for offensive missions. The professor and his crew had achieved something remarkable. They had turned a sanctuary into a liability, and in doing so, they had demonstrated a principle that would echo through military academies for generations. In modern warfare, there are no truly safe spaces, only varying degrees of risk, managed through discipline, intelligence, and the willingness to wait for the perfect moment. The battery commander, interviewed months later by Ukrainian military intelligence for training purposes, was asked what lesson he would emphasize to future air defense crews. His answer was simple: patience isn't passive. It's the most aggressive tactic we have, because when you finally strike, your enemy has forgotten you were hunting them. The loss of 3 Su-34 aircraft in a single engagement sent shockwaves through Russian military command. These weren't aging Soviet-era fighters, they were modern, 4th-generation plus strike aircraft, each worth approximately $50 million, representing years of pilot training and tactical development. More concerning than the material loss was the psychological impact. Russian pilots, who had operated with relative impunity from forward air bases, now faced a terrifying reality. Ukrainian air defenses could reach them during their most vulnerable moments, takeoff and landing. Within 48 hours, Russian air operations changed dramatically. Launch times became randomized. Flight paths varied. Aircraft numbers decreased. Some forward air bases ceased fixed-wing operations entirely, relocating squadrons to bases deeper inside Russian territory. The tactical adjustment came at a strategic cost. Longer flight times meant less time on station, fewer sorties per day, reduced payload capacity due to increased fuel requirements. Ukrainian ground forces gained breathing room. Russian close air support became less responsive, less frequent, less effective. NATO military analysts studying the engagement identified several key factors that enabled Ukrainian success. First, intelligence preparation. The operation required detailed surveillance of Russian flight patterns, base activities, and operational timing. This intelligence came from multiple sources: satellite imagery, signals intelligence, human intelligence networks inside occupied territory, and NATO surveillance assets providing real-time data. The fusion of these intelligence streams created a comprehensive picture that allowed Ukrainian commanders to predict with high confidence when and where Russian aircraft would be. Vulnerable. Second, tactical patience. The Ukrainian crew maintained position for 7 days under challenging conditions. Military psychologists note that this level of discipline requires exceptional training and morale. The crew had to resist the temptation to engage earlier targets, maintaining operational security despite the psychological pressure. Third, technological effectiveness. Despite being Soviet-era systems, the S-300 missiles proved devastatingly effective when employed correctly. The engagement reinforced an important lesson. In modern warfare, how you use weapons often matters more than which weapons you have. Fourth, integration with electronic warfare. Ukrainian EW units jammed Russian communications during the critical seconds of the engagement, delaying Russian response and creating confusion. This coordination between air defense and electronic warfare assets demonstrated sophisticated combined arms operations. The engagement also highlighted vulnerabilities in Russian doctrine. The predictable timing and flight patterns suggested either inadequate operational security or insufficient concern for Ukrainian air defense capabilities. Either way, the complacency proved fatal. Within 2 weeks of the engagement, Russian air operations across the entire theater adjusted. Aircraft began flying at extremely low altitude. below radar coverage, or at very high altitude, beyond the effective range of Ukrainian systems. This protected the aircraft but reduced their effectiveness against ground targets. The psychological impact extended beyond Russian forces. Ukrainian morale surged, social media filled with videos and images, though carefully edited to avoid revealing operational details. The message was clear. Ukrainian forces were not merely defending, they were hunting. Western military aid accelerated. The engagement demonstrated that Ukrainian forces could effectively employ sophisticated weapons systems, making the case for additional advanced air defense platforms. Within months, Patriot missile systems, NASAMS, and IRIS-T systems began arriving in Ukraine, but perhaps the most significant impact was doctrinal. The engagement became a case study at military academies worldwide, demonstrating how patient, intelligence-driven air defense operations could counter numerically superior air forces. The United States Air Force incorporated lessons from the engagement into its suppression of enemy air defenses doctrine. NATO exercises began including scenarios where air defense operators employed ambush tactics rather than traditional reactive engagement. Israeli defense forces, long considered the world's experts in operating against sophisticated air defenses, studied the engagement intensively. The concept of using mobility and intelligence to create temporary windows of superiority, rather than attempting permanent control, aligned with developing theories about future combat. Ukrainian air defense officers were invited to brief NATO commanders on their tactics and techniques. The information sharing went beyond the specific engagement, covering broader concepts: how to maintain operational security in an age of ubiquitous surveillance, how to integrate diverse intelligence sources, how to maintain crew morale during extended deployments. One NATO general, speaking at a defense conference in Brussels, summarized it this way: the Ukrainians have written a new chapter in air defense doctrine. They've demonstrated that patience, properly applied, is as effective as the most advanced technology. They turned a defensive system into an offensive weapon. Russian responses evolved as well. Air-based defenses were reinforced with additional short-range air defense systems. Flight operations became more decentralized and unpredictable. Some aircraft were relocated to bases beyond Ukrainian missile range entirely. These adjustments consumed resources and complicated operations. Every additional air defense system protecting an airbase was one fewer system protecting ground forces. Every aircraft relocated hundreds of kilometers rearward, reduced sortie rates and mission flexibility. In this way, a single 90-second engagement created cascading effects across an entire theater of operations. Satellite imagery analysis revealed the scope of adjustments. Russian aircraft dispersal patterns changed. Hardened aircraft shelters were constructed at forward bases. Some bases that previously operated 20 aircraft were reduced to 6 or 8, spreading assets to minimize losses from any single strike. But dispersal creates its own problems. Maintenance becomes more difficult, logistics more complex, coordination more challenging, response times increase. The efficiency of centralized air operations degrades. Military economists calculated that the cost of Russian adaptations, in terms of reduced operational efficiency, additional defensive systems, relocated assets, and changed procedures, exceeded $2 billion. The cost of the Ukrainian operation that triggered these changes, approximately $30 million in missiles, plus the operational costs of maintaining one battery for 7 days. This cost asymmetry is the essence of asymmetric warfare. Smaller forces using intelligence, patience, and precision impose disproportionate costs on larger adversaries. The goal isn't to win every engagement, but to make every engagement so costly that the adversary changes behavior, accepts constraints, and operates less effectively. The engagement also demonstrated the evolving nature of modern warfare. Traditional metrics, who has more tanks, more aircraft, more soldiers, matter less than the ability to integrate intelligence, execute coordinated operations, and exploit fleeting opportunities. Future warfare, analysts concluded, would favor forces that could operate in this paradigm. Networked, agile, patient, and precise. Size still mattered, but so did speed of decision-making, quality of intelligence, and discipline of execution. The Ukrainian air defense community internalized these lessons. Training programs expanded, emphasizing not just technical proficiency, but tactical patience and psychological resilience. New crews studied the engagement as their primary case study. how to identify opportunities, how to maintain position under pressure, how to execute under fire. One Ukrainian air defense commander, speaking anonymously to maintain operational security, described the philosophy: "We don't hunt every target. We hunt the right target at the right time. Patience is our weapon. Intelligence is our ammunition. Discipline is our shield." This mindset represented a fundamental shift from Soviet-era doctrine, which emphasized volume of fire and immediate engagement. The new Ukrainian approach borrowed from Western philosophies, particularly Israeli and American, that prioritized quality over quantity, patience over reaction, and results over activity. The crew that conducted the engagement received Ukraine's highest military honors. Their identities remained classified, but their achievement entered military legend. In Ukrainian air defense circles, they became known by a call sign, the Silent Hunters. Their success spawned a new generation of air defense operators who embraced the philosophy of disciplined engagement. Training courses began, including psychological preparation for extended deployments, teaching soldiers how to manage stress, maintain focus, and resist the temptation to act prematurely. The engagement also influenced Ukrainian procurement priorities. Rather than seeking only the newest, most advanced systems, planners emphasized mobility, integration, and training. The lesson was clear: a properly employed older system could be more effective than an improperly employed modern one. Western military advisors working with Ukrainian forces noted the shift. One American officer observed, "Early in the war, they wanted every weapon system we could provide. Now they're more selective. They want systems that fit their doctrine, that enhance their tactical approach, that enable the kind of patient, precise operations they've proven so effective at." This maturation of military thinking, from reactive defense to proactive hunting, represented one of the war's most significant developments. Ukraine wasn't just surviving, it was innovating, adapting, and teaching lessons that would influence military doctrine worldwide for decades to come. War has always been a contest between innovation and adaptation. Throughout history, new technologies and tactics emerge, dominate briefly, then are countered by adversaries who learn, adapt, and overcome. The engagement we've examined represents this eternal cycle. Ukrainian forces faced a superior adversary with greater numbers, more advanced equipment, and the tactical initiative. Traditional military doctrine suggested they should lose, quickly, decisively, overwhelmingly, but they didn't, and the reason reveals fundamental truths about modern warfare. 21st century conflict is fought as much with information as with explosives. The side that sees first understands faster, and acts more precisely gains advantage regardless of numerical disparities. Intelligence, comprehensive real-time, actionable intelligence, has become as decisive as any weapon system. The Ukrainian operation succeeded because intelligence provided a complete picture, what the enemy would do, when they would do it, and where they would be vulnerable. That intelligence created opportunity. Training and discipline allowed forces to exploit that opportunity, and courage enabled them to accept the risk inherent in the plan. But intelligence alone isn't sufficient. The engagement also required something more fundamental: the psychological strength to wait. In an age of instant gratification and constant stimulation, the ability to wait, truly wait, patiently and deliberately, has become a rare and valuable skill. Military forces worldwide struggle with this. The temptation to act, to engage, to shoot is overwhelming. Training emphasizes action, decisiveness, aggression, but sometimes the most aggressive action is patience. The most decisive move is to wait. The most powerful use of force is to hold fire until the perfect moment. Ukrainian air defense operators mastered this paradox. They transformed waiting from passive inaction into active weapon. Every hour of patience increased their advantage. Every day of discipline raised the probability of success. This concept, patience as weapon, will influence military doctrine for decades. Already, NATO training programs incorporate scenarios where patience and timing matter more than speed and volume of fire. Future officers study the engagement not just for its tactical details, but for its psychological dimensions. The engagement also revealed how smaller nations can contest larger adversaries. Ukraine's military budget is a fraction of Russia's. Their armed forces are outnumbered. Their defense industry is smaller. By traditional measures, they should be overwhelmed. Yet they've survived, adapted, and in many cases prevailed. How? By refusing to fight the way their adversary expected, by choosing their battles carefully, by exploiting intelligence advantages, by making every shot count because they couldn't afford to waste ammunition. This is the future of warfare for mid-sized and smaller nations. They cannot match peer adversaries in quantity, so they must exceed them in quality. Quality of intelligence, quality of training, quality of tactical execution. The engagement also demonstrated the importance of alliances. NATO surveillance assets provided targeting data. Western intelligence agencies shared reconnaissance information. Allied nations supplied weapons systems and training. Without this ecosystem of support, Ukrainian forces would have operated blind and isolated. Modern warfare has become too complex, too technologically sophisticated for any single nation, even large ones, to excel across all domains. Partnership, integration, and interoperability are force multipliers as significant as any weapon system. Russian forces learned this lesson the hard way, operating largely in isolation. Without Allied intelligence support, they found themselves at an information disadvantage despite superior numbers. Their lack of integration with sophisticated intelligence networks left them vulnerable to precisely the kind of ambush Ukrainian forces executed. Looking forward, military planners see the engagement as a preview of future conflict. Wars will be fought by networked forces operating with comprehensive intelligence pictures, striking precisely at moments of maximum advantage, then dispersing before enemies can respond. Mass still matters. Numbers provide depth, resilience, staying power. But mass without precision is increasingly vulnerable. The future belongs to forces that combine both. Enough platforms to provide coverage and redundancy, employed with enough precision to maximize effect and minimize waste. Air defense, specifically, is undergoing revolutionary change. Traditional doctrine treated it as reactive, respond to threats, shoot them down, defend assets. The new paradigm treats air defense as proactive, hunt threats, ambush them, impose costs that change enemy behavior. Emerging technologies will amplify these trends. Artificial intelligence will process intelligence data faster than human analysts. Unmanned systems will provide persistent surveillance without crew fatigue. Networked sensors will create comprehensive battle space awareness impossible today, but technology alone won't determine outcomes. The engagement demonstrated that human factors, training, discipline, courage, patience, remain decisive. Machines can calculate optimal solutions, but humans must have the judgment to recognize opportunities and the discipline to exploit them. The Ukrainian soldiers who executed this operation weren't superhuman. They didn't possess exotic technologies or secret capabilities. They had standard equipment, solid training, and exceptional leadership. What set them apart was their willingness to embrace discomfort, to maintain discipline, to trust the plan, even when every instinct urged immediate action. These are trainable qualities. Any military force, properly led and trained, can develop them. The question is whether military cultures will embrace the philosophy, whether commanders will reward patience as much as aggression, whether training systems will emphasize discipline as much as decisiveness. Early indications suggest many militaries are attempting this cultural shift, but institutional change is difficult and slow. Old doctrines die hard. Officers trained to value speed and aggression struggle to reward subordinates who excel at patience and timing. The militaries that successfully make this transition will dominate future battlefields. Those that cling to industrial-age doctrines, emphasizing mass, volume, and speed above precision, patience, and timing, will find themselves increasingly vulnerable. This isn't to suggest that traditional military capabilities are obsolete. Numbers still matter. Firepower remains essential. Logistics determines what's possible, but these fundamentals must be enhanced with new skills: intelligence fusion, patient execution, network integration, and adaptive learning. The human cost of this engagement and the broader conflict should not be forgotten amid tactical analysis. 4 Russian aircrew died in the 90 seconds of combat. They were following orders, executing missions, serving their country as they understood their duty. Their deaths, like all war deaths, represent tragedy and waste. War is ultimately about human beings making life-and-death decisions under extraordinary pressure. Technology shapes the battlefield, but humans fight it. The Ukrainian crew that waited 7 days in hiding demonstrated courage equal to any frontline assault. The Russian pilots who launched into dangerous skies showed bravery, regardless of their mission's outcome. Military professionals study engagements like this to win future conflicts, ideally by deterring them entirely. The goal of military capability isn't war, it's peace achieved through strength sufficient to make aggression unwise. Ukraine's demonstrated ability to inflict severe costs on Russian forces creates deterrence and complicates Russian calculations. Every successful Ukrainian operation raises the cost of continued aggression, strengthens Ukraine's negotiating position, and makes eventual peace more achievable on terms that protect Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. This is the strategic purpose behind tactical operations. Individual engagements like the air defense ambush contribute to broader strategic objectives, demonstrating capability, imposing costs, changing enemy behavior, and creating conditions for favorable conflict resolution. The soldiers who waited 7 days in hiding, then executed a perfect ambush in 90 seconds, changed the course of air operations over an entire theater. They demonstrated that patience is a weapon, that discipline is a force multiplier, and that smaller forces with superior intelligence and tactics can defeat larger adversaries. Their success provides hope, not just for Ukraine, but for all nations facing larger, more powerful adversaries. It demonstrates that victory doesn't always go to the strongest, but often to the smartest, the most patient, and the most disciplined. Wars end, but lessons endure. Decades from now, military academies will still study this engagement. Officers will still debate the decisions, analyze the tactics, and extract lessons applicable to their own contexts. They'll study the intelligence preparation that created opportunity, the tactical patience that maximized success, the disciplined execution that turned plan into reality, the courage that enabled soldiers to hold position under pressure. But most importantly, they'll study the mindset, the philosophy that transformed defensive weapons into offensive tools, that made waiting as aggressive as attacking, that proved the decisive moment in combat isn't always the loudest or most violent, but sometimes the quietest and most carefully timed. In the pre-dawn darkness of Eastern Europe, Ukrainian air defense operators still sit at their consoles, watching their screens, waiting, breathing, fingers hovering over firing controls. They know their adversary is still out there, still launching aircraft, still threatening their homeland, but they also know they're not helpless. They've proven that skill, intelligence, and patience can counter superior numbers. They've demonstrated that the hunted can become the hunter. They've shown the world that modern warfare rewards not just strength, but wisdom, not just power, but precision, not just action, but patience. And somewhere, at Russian air bases across the theater, pilots climbing into their cockpits wonder if today will be the day that Ukrainian air defenses are waiting for them. Patient, invisible, and deadly. That uncertainty, that doubt, that fear, these are the fruits of patient, professional, devastating success. This is how smaller forces impose their will on larger ones. This is how Ukraine has survived. And this is how future conflicts will be fought. The sky is no longer dominated by whoever has the most aircraft. It belongs to whoever has the best intelligence, the most discipline, and the patience to wait for the perfect moment. Ukraine waited. And when the moment came, they struck with devastating precision. The lesson is clear. In modern warfare, patience isn't passive. Patience is power.